Hello everyone, my name is Philip and I welcome you back at the sixth tutorial from the tutorial series focused on development on Algorand using Raspberry Pi. Today we will cover and introduce Sandbox from Algorand. So firstly we will a little bit motivate why would we like to use Sandbox instead of previously mentioned solution. We will also mention which tools are part of this Sandbox approach, and finally we will also cover some requirements and how to set it up on our Raspberry Pi. So firstly, why do we want to use Sandbox and why would we develop on Sandbox for Algorand network? So as introduced in previous tutorials, to develop on Algorand, we can set up a node and connect to the network. And as you might have known from previous tutorials, this requires quite some time because we have to actually synchronize to the network. And in case you want to have the archival node fully running, it actually requires also quite some space. And of course, this in general introduces some overhead. And this overhead is especially crucial in case we want to query for some information from the blockchain, Algorand blockchain. And for that, we introduce the tool called Indexer, which is requiring a full archival node. And also on top of it, it's also requiring the installation of Postgres database, where actually we store all of the list of the transactions, which we can later on query. So in case we don't want to have this full-blown solution, and we want to still develop on Algorand, there is a more lightweight solution where we can basically start and do some initial development, which is called Sandbox. And in this tutorial, we will cover the Sandbox, how to use it, and in general get more familiar with it, and try to find out the strengths of Sandbox for the use case. So firstly, where operates the Sandbox when we look at it? So during the tutorial, we will cover the part of setting up the Sandbox, and overall the Sandbox is running in direction of the private networks where we have it, we can develop on it and so on. But in the default configuration, we cannot really communicate with the other available networks, meaning such as the betanet, testnet or mainnet. But also Sandbox is possible to actually connect to these available networks, which we will cover. And this is something what we can do in the future once we have certain development already up and running. But for the initial setup and getting familiar, it's recommended to start in the area of private networks. And for that is Sandbox perfect because it can not only run the basic node, but it can also run the indexer, so we can actually start with initial steps and getting familiar with the full Algorand dev tools. I already touched a bit, but also let's just put the full information. So actually which tools are included in the Sandbox. So the first tool is called Algorand, which you might have already know from previous tutorials, which is used to manage the network node itself. Then we have the goal tool, which is used to manage the transactions. And also in some sense, actually the goal tool is using both the Algorand and the key management, the KMD tool, which is used for managing the accounts. And finally, which I think is a real strength of a Sandbox, it also combines the usage of the indexer to query some basic data from the ledger. And Sandbox, which we will introduce later, the requirement, which is Docker and Docker Compose, comes already with the full packages as a part of the repository, and therefore it's really easy to start and get familiar with the usage and setting up of the development environment on the Sandbox, with basically installing the requirements and then hopefully more plug and play solution where we can just build the corresponding Docker containers using the predefined Docker Compose file and start with development on the Sandbox environment. The requirements to actually start with development on Sandbox are rather easy, so we need to install Docker containers, we need to install Docker Compose, and then also for this specific solution which we have on the Raspberry Pi, we also have to install some other dependencies which I will introduce later on. To cover the steps, what we're gonna do, so in the first phase, as I mentioned, we will introduce and install the required dependencies. And in the second part, we will start the Sandbox itself, get familiar with the most important command line interface commands. And in the next part, we will then connect the JavaScript SDK to the Sandbox and start to do some initial transactions. So let's dive into the explanation and the idea of how to start the Sandbox itself. So as mentioned, Sandbox is relying on Docker containers. So we have to, of course, start with installation of those. And For installing the Docker Compose itself, you actually require Python 3 and pip3. So in case you don't have it installed yet from previous tutorial, I would recommend you to navigate to tutorial part 2, where we exactly do the steps. And now diving into the installation of Docker containers. So we will download the Docker container base script, which basically is later on executed to install all of the required packages and required dependencies for the Docker containers itself. So in general, it's also good practice after you download it actually to have a short look and see if actually there is no malicious or suspicious code in this script. So you have a look, and after you are confident that everything is fine, you can execute this base script. And in case you want to avoid always running the Docker containers commands with the sudo front of it, you can run this command where you basically put the main user which you are currently connected as to execute the Docker commands without the need of sudo. And to successfully check it's installed, you can just execute the Docker version from the command line and you should see the corresponding version. And you can also list the currently running Docker containers, which as expected should be empty. And as for many other languages, or the first setup to make sure that everything is successfully running, I would recommend you to run and install the first Docker container, the hello world Docker, and that way basically you see that everything is functional. So we can do it together. So here you can see the version of the Docker, and now we can execute together the Docker run and start the hello world Docker container. And we see hello from Docker. So it means that in case you see that everything is successfully installed, and to list the Docker container, so we see that actually that already exited after it was successfully started approximately a minute ago. And we of course can always remove this container, so we will do docker rm, we will take the Docker ID and just remove it, and that way we see that there is no more instance of the Docker. In the next step, after installation Docker, we also want to install Docker Compose, where Docker Compose is a tool to operate and build basically our own Docker containers image. And the Docker Compose is relying on the definitions defined in the Docker Compose.yaml file, which we will go through it in the case of the Sandbox to have a feeling on it. And in case you follow previous tutorials, you should still need to install following dependencies. And finally, after you successfully install all of the dependencies, you should see the corresponding version in the command line of the Docker Compose. And with that, we will be pretty much done. There is only a specific requirements for the Sandbox installation, which is caused by the installation of Raspberry Pi and the usage of PostgreSQL and by using the PostgreSQL 13 based on the Alpine image, which is introducing certain challenge on the Raspberry. And there is a following fix that we need to, of course, have certain version of Docker containers, which we already are fulfilling, and we in addition have to install the labs.comp library, and with that we will not face any challenges during starting of the Sandbox on the Raspberry Pi. And now when we have all dependencies installed, it's done for the tutorial video part 1.